often if you make something accessible for disabled people, neurodivergent people, what you're actually doing is making it better for everybody. I think it's a money maker. Again, if you make an organization more accessible, you're going to have less burnout, less dropouts from your neurodivergent employees. You're going to connect with neurodivergent customers better. No matter how hard a barrier looks like, it can be abolished, even if it looks like it can't be. I mean, you used to have slavery. We used to have the divine right of kings. If we can get rid of them, I'm pretty sure we can have a community that's neurodivergent inclusive.
Hello and welcome to Inclusive Future Voices for Change, a British Council-funded video series exploring how inclusion and accessibility are transforming higher education and beyond. I'm Dr. Ying Wu from University of Dundee, and today's episode is titled Leading with Neurodiversity. I'm delighted to be joined by Tánaiste Custance, the president of Dundee University Students Association, or DUSA. Tánaiste has been an advocate for neurodivergent voices, inclusive leadership, and community representation. Tánaiste, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Brilliant. Neurodiversity is a term we hear more often now. What does it personally mean to you, and how has it shaped the way you see the world?
Yeah, it's a very interesting one. For me, I got a diagnosis of autism when I was about 8 or 9, and I'm 32 years old now, and that was the framing which I had for neurodiversity for quite a while. And then in relatively recent years, in the last 5 or 10 years, I think the language that we're using is getting more inclusive, and neurodiversity is an excellent word, I think, an excellent framing to understand that actually we're all human beings with different ways of being, different ways of interpreting the world, beautifully diverse, equally valid. And I think it's good that we have moved away from the origins of, for example, autism or ADHD, which have obviously come through the medical system with all of the, or sometimes worse. If you go back to kind of there are some kind of slightly Nazi origins for some of the understanding of autism, going back to like Hans Asperger, for example. I think it's good that we've moved away from the more medicalized models of understanding what it is to be human and appreciate that your neurotype is something that is fundamental to who you are. To who we all are, and that no particular neurotype is objectively better or worse than others, but that we understand that having a majority culture, majority neurotypical culture with structures and institutions can make it difficult for life for neurodivergent people. So for me, it's been very essential. It's understanding who I am in this world. And in navigating the challenges that we create, I think, as a society unnecessarily for neurodivergent people. But I think it's a lovely word as well. I quite like this. I think there's a word called neurocosmopolitan.
Neurocosmopolitan.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that is coined by Dr. Name is suddenly escaping me. Dr. Nick, I can't remember her second name. Suddenly escaped me very bad. But she did a book called Neuroqueer Heresies, and among her terms was neurocosmopolitan. I think that's the kind of society eventually we'll kind of have, work towards by being inclusive.
That is a beautiful word. I'm loving it. Yeah, it's the first time I heard about it, although we are doing this study. Yeah. So it's great to hear from you who are so experienced today. And you actually mentioned that you love the word neurodivergent more than the previous medical words. Yeah. So have you experienced like any changes in your life when the wording has been changed?
Well, I think there's kind of two aspects to that. There's one is my own internal sense of self and how I understand myself. And then the second part is how the rest of the world, understands or doesn't understand me. Yeah. I think if I think through my experiences in the educational system, just as one example, sometimes a diagnosis of autism is very helpful at getting my basic human rights met. I think that's kind of the important aspect of a diagnosis in the way that our society works, is that your protected characteristics of disability, for example. If you don't have a diagnosis, you may or may not get them. You may not get them met. I mean, having a diagnosis doesn't mean you'll get it either. But I think in particular, there was a period of my life where I kind of really quite as an outgoing and becoming an adult, really kind of retreated into a particular kind of autistic identity. What I mean by that is really seeing everything purely from the lens of autism, rather than the other aspects of my identity. So class is a big one, for example. I think you can't really talk about neurodiversity and neurotypes without talking about class. I would say that my neurotype and my autism is classed, and my class is neurotypes. You can't really, as it's also gendered as well, I don't think you can disaggregate, really. I don't think you can. It's always useful to analyze things, but I think if you analyze a human being and separate them into these categories, I think you can kind of really lose sight of what it is to be a human. I think that's helpful for a lot of institutions, but I don't think really from the perspective of what it is to be human and what it is to be a kind of free individual, that these labels should have the kind of rigidity. But I think it's also good that I would say also that the neurodivergent community, or the neurodivergent communities, generally have had a better understanding of themselves than the medical system had. I think that's getting better, partly because you actually have neurodivergent medical professionals who are actually creating knowledge, academic and scientific knowledge on what it is to be neurodivergent. And that's very helpful, I think. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, so changes are happening, and you do see an improvement now. And it's always better to separate the medical terms with this. So you prefer the word neurodivergence?
I think it's. I think the medical framing for it is just very limited, and it has its
stereotypes of people.
Yeah, partly the stereotypes, but also because they are, the medical system is part of one system of power, and power can be less or more democratic. And I think, again, if you go through the history of it, I mean, again, the kind of concepts of autism, when they are created, and when they're kind of scientifically being created, it was, in kind of Nazi Germany, the USSR, and kind of America, with differing approaches. And at that point, it was particularly the case of Nazi Germany, the kind of framing of autism as a diagnosis was absolutely wrapped up in the early stages of the Holocaust. So, I mean, there's very interesting books on this. One by, I can't remember the name of the author actually, but the book is called Asperger's Children, looking at the kind of history of this. I think it's very interesting to... it's important that we actually understand that science is, historically, politically, culturally conditioned. And when it comes to something like, again, an aspect of what it is to be human, I think we haven't really fully reckoned with the, let's say, best mixed picture that science has done for, neurodivergent people. And I still don't think at this point we're not. I think generally there has been progress. People have got better. Science has got better understanding of what it is, what neurodiversity is. But even at this point, I think there's a lot. There's still a lot of progress to make, and there's also the serious threat of regression, and you can see that with some of the far right leaders around the world, and I include people like Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage in this country, who will use neurodiversity and autism as examples of our society has become over-medicated or degenerate or whatever language they want to use. There is a scary aspect of the rise of the far right that absolutely, as it did 90 years ago, will go after people like me. So I think it's, again, to kind of go back to answering your question, how kind of important it is. I think it's very important to have a understanding not just of who you are, but also how the rest of the world is perceiving you, and to act on that to ensure that we have our human rights and everybody has the human rights actually met, which shouldn't be controversial, but actually it is, and this will
So we still need to make more changes.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. Well, I mean, we still have, we've had a society now which in some forms has become more egalitarian and equal in terms of social rights, for example. So again, we have the Equality Act, we'll have rights for disabled people, for example. But on the other hand, wealth inequality has just been getting worse and worse for like 5 decades now. And overwhelmingly, that particularly impacts on disabled people. I mean, I'm not sure if we're ever going to have a full kind of death toll of the number of disabled people, or autistic or neurodivergent people who, for example, have died because of the UK austerity program over the last 15 years. It's probably quite a substantial figure. I think there's UN reports. I'm trying to remember the details of it, but there certainly was a UN report on the effect of the welfare cuts on disabled people in the UK. So in terms of being inclusive, there are definitely things that are good signs in terms of both popular and professional understanding of autism. I think that's definitely got better. But in some ways, just as it has for a lot of other people in society, there are actually regressions. Sometimes the law has got better or the rights on paper have got better, but the actual practice has actually got worse. And in terms of kind of the things of what universities can do, I think there's a lot more that universities could be doing to create the kind of egalitarian, equal society that I think most of us probably want to live in. But that's that kind of goes to what the function of a university is, and that's probably a different talk.
But it's so helpful.
Yeah.
So it's so important to recognize the importance of such talks. And you are so knowledgeable in the origins and the histories of everything, so well read in this area.
Well, I mean, it's I think it's important to know. As I said, part of my journey has just been trying to understand who I am. As we all do as humans, we're trying to understand who we are. And I think particularly in my case, as a lot of neurodivergent people have a lot of experience of suffering or oppression. And, I'm lucky in that I'm someone who's had that experience and survived to now. And I take I've been quite interested in history anyway, history and politics. Having an interest in why the world is as it is, how, why you have the experiences that you have. I think it's a very important aspect of being human in a society, is to understand where we're coming from and also where we're going. And then also to work out where you can influence and how you can influence the world so it does get better. I don't think it's a particularly I don't think it is a particularly neurodivergent thing, though. I think we might come on to kind of neurodivergent leadership and what leads people, neurodivergent people, into particular kind of paths. But I think that's a kind of duty and responsibility of all of us as human beings with moral compasses. I think the alternative is to either actively make the world worse or pretend that we don't have any influence. It's not how I want to live my life.
Yeah. Since you mentioned neurodivergent leaders,
Sure.
let's just go there actually.
Sure.
Because you are a neurodivergent leader yourself. You are the school president for the Student Association, which is the biggest student association in the university. So do you want to have yourself as an example, talking more about neurodivergent leadership and also more leadership, maybe roles? Yeah.
Oh God, where to start? I can talk a bit about myself. I try not to, because I think kind of reluctant, focus too much on myself, because I don't really think I'm that important here. I think in terms of neurodivergent leadership, funnily enough, in the case of student unions, I see a lot of neurodivergent student leaders, people who stand for election and then get elected into leadership roles. If you go to any conference of student leaders, I find that there'll be a lot of fidget toys and a lot of kind of very stimmy behaviour. I think there's a lot of neurodivergent, neurospicy or spectrumy people in the room. It's quite interesting, and I'm not 100% sure why, but I think it's a good thing. I think perhaps it could be an example of how perhaps there are less barriers for perhaps neurodivergent students becoming leaders than there are, say, for adults. You don't tend to see a lot of openly declared neurodivergent adult leaders. If I think in the realm of, for example, politics, I mean, try and find an openly autistic MP. I think there was only one, Jared O'Mara in Britain, and his career was pretty terrible. He had a but anyway, he's not important, but I don't think there are any. 650 MPs, and I don't think any of them are autistic. I think there's one openly autistic member of the Scottish Parliament, Lorna Slater. She doesn't tend to talk about it much, but she doesn't hide it. So I think there are various barriers, and I think a lot of that is stigma. I think a lot of it is misunderstanding, discrimination, the kind of similar kind of dynamics that we have seen and do see with gender, with race, with sexuality, so on. And I think I think the cultural representation as well of autistic and neurodivergent people is, well, I mean, it varies, but I think a lot of it is really, truly dire and woeful. And I think a lot of that has contributed, and it's contributed to and come from, again, as I said earlier, the medicalized origins of the concepts of autism and ADHD. So, I mean, good classic example, you think of kind of classic kind of representations of autism, for example. In the last 50 years, you might think of like Rain Man, you might think of, generally it's kind of like a very socially awkward, hyper-intelligent male, which is, okay, that exists, but there's a whole spectrum of behaviors, neurotypes, and that is something which, again, the public understanding and the scientific understanding is getting there. I think it has made significant improvements since I was a kid. But it's in terms of what makes. I think there's also there's definitely barriers, cultural barriers, social barriers for neurodivergent leaders to emerge, but you do see them in particular areas, and some of them are really quite. Take two really contrasting examples: Elon Musk and Greta Thunberg. I can't really think of two people who are kind of polar opposites in so many ways. And both of them have cited their neurotype, their autism, as totally crucial to who they are and getting where they are. And I think I have less of an interest in Elon Musk, but I can see in the case of Greta Thunberg absolutely that hyper focus, the monotropic vision on the climate crisis, which is just objectively possibly the most important thing for the human species to deal with right now. And to be able to focus on that and set aside completely irrelevant things in comparison to that. And everybody can perceive that is a total strength for her. She understands it herself. And it's something that has led her to, being probably one of the most high-profile human rights activists, on the planet. But again, I said earlier, you can't just look at autism or neurotype in isolation. You have to think about class. And this is no criticism of Greta Thunberg or Elon Musk. Actually, I mean, in their case, they come from a relative amount of privilege, upper middle class backgrounds. Or in the case of Elon Musk, I think, what was he, a divorced emerald slave mine inheritor. But again, going back to Greta Thunberg, yes, you've got, in that case, someone who's upper middle class and is able to make the most of that. But there'll be a lot of neurodivergent leaders who are poor, working class, or lumpen, proletarian, or whatever language you want to use, whose potential often does not get seen. There aren't opportunities to bring that out. And you think about things, for example, access to university. Think of all the barriers it takes to get to university. You have to survive school, for a start. And I use the word survive literally there. There are lots of barriers that I think particularly apply to neurodivergent people that actually are really kind of class barriers, I think, often. And it's also kind of going to a slightly different way of thinking about accessibility, for example. often if you make something accessible for disabled people, neurodivergent people, what you're actually doing is making it better for everybody. And what you're actually doing is you can kind of see it one of two ways. You can have the view of, right, these are neurodivergent people, these are annoying people who are putting additional pressures on the public purse or, the university or whatever to put, resources in. Or you can say, well, actually, no, this is brilliant. These are people who are highlighting something about how our society works. They are showing, when they are experiencing suffering, they are kind of canaries in the coal mine, or they are at the sharp end of a social ill that exists in our society, such as inequality, wealth inequality. And I think often it's not seen like that. I think we miss, just as we do with a lot of people without, a lot of people without privilege. I think they don't get the opportunities that they deserve to become fully themselves. So trying to go back to the kind of original question, neurodivergent leaders, I think, it can't be divorced from the wider social issues of how our society, how our planet is run. But I think it certainly would encourage any, particularly any neurodivergent person, to find the strength that is within them in their experience, including their suffering. No one is defined by the suffering unless they totally choose to make it that way. And it's not to dismiss anybody's suffering, but actually, certainly for my case, having had the ability to reflect on my pain in the past and grow from it, and also choose to grow from it, and also have the privilege and the ability to grow from it, I've learned a lot from it. I've learned a lot from that suffering about what it is to be human and what our society is. But I'm just aware that there are people who don't have those abilities or opportunities. So, yeah, leave it there, I think.
So in order to have more difficulties, sufferings, and challenges to be heard, and even to be sitting here and sharing your thoughts, in a podcast series and things like that, what kind of changes do you think that needs to be happening in organizations, in society, in general views, etc., to provide such opportunities, and also for the working class, etc., to take better care of everyone?
Yeah. Well, I think that your question kind of has the answer in it. There it is. Do we have a society that values and nurtures everybody and gives them the resources and the ability to do that? I think you can't have full inclusion in the context of increasing inequality. You can make. This is not to disparage the good work, for example, that goes on in EDI, equality, diversity, inclusion, including in big organizations. I mean, it's important that any organization takes equality and diversity and inclusion seriously. It's important that they have anti-bullying policies, for example, and that people's protected characteristics are protected. It's good that the law, that we have laws that do protect that and that they can be enforced. But it's all those big caveats. Are those laws properly enforced? Are the mechanisms by which they actually happen? Are they fully resourced? Are people able to access their rights? And again, it's kind of every aspect of where people are not able to access the rights that they deserve, that they're entitled to. When it comes to neurodiversity, inclusion of neurodivergent people, that absolutely applies in spades. And I think in that case, for neurodivergent people, I think it's important to have there's a writer called Dr. Robert Chapman who wrote a book called Empire of Normality, Neurodiversity and Capitalism, and mostly kind of about the kind of history of neurodiversity and autism in particular. But towards the end, they were getting at a point of advocating for a kind of neuroclass solidarity, or neurodivergent class solidarity. And I think that it's important for neurodivergent people ourselves to find both our individual, but crucially our collective voice, collective power. I think the best way of ensuring that a community is fully included is for that community to have to be organized to have social power, not over anybody, but simply just to have their own rights and being respected. So in terms of what organizations can do, I would say listen to the neurodivergent members of your organization, listen to the neurodivergent staff. In the case of a university, listen to the staff, listen to the students, get training. I would say get training from trainers who are themselves neurodivergent. When it comes to policy, have that written by neurodivergent people. I think that's that kind of inclusion, genuine co-collaboration and co-authorship of organizational policies is crucial. I think it also applies to research as well. Again, why do we have, to what extent are neurodivergent voices setting the agenda for research into neurodiversity, for example? I mean, the number of times I've seen I'm not a scientist by any stretch, but there's way too many journal articles about, for example, eye contact in autistic people, as opposed to let's actually look at what the structural barriers are in our society. And I think there's such a gap between the two. But again, if you look at the priorities of autistic and neurodivergent people, generally number one, if you ask, most surveys that I've seen, they're like priority number one, mental health. Priority number two is inclusion and employment. So let's actually have research that is informed by those priorities. So again, I think I keep trying to kind of broaden it from neurodiversity to make the point that I think what makes a society or an organization inclusive of neurodivergent people, neurodivergent voices, it's not asking for any special dispensation. I don't want special rights as an autistic person. What I want is to have my basic human rights respected, as I do for everybody else, And I think a similar argument applies for trans people, for example. The anti-trans position or lobby, one argument that they use is, for example, why trans people already have legal rights and aren't they just asking for special treatment? No, I mean, actually, they're just asking for the basic dignity to be respected in the way that cis people's dignity is respected all the time. It's not asking for anything special. They're literally just asking to be equal. They're just asking to be raised from the position they've been put in.
Yes.
By the law and by structures, power, to a position with everybody else. Same with neurodivergent people. I think we're quite lucky that we don't have a kind of autistic supremacist I mean, maybe there's tiny little niche, weird corners that do have that, but overwhelmingly, all of the neurodiversity movement, it's entirely about equality. It's all about raising everybody up and understanding the value that the neurodivergent voice has. I'd also say, again, it's kind of cost efficient. If we're kind of thinking with a business hat on, I think it's a money maker.
Yeah.
Again, if you make an organization more accessible, you're going to have less burnout, less dropouts from your neurodivergent employees. You're going to connect with neurodivergent customers better. I mean, I try not to make a kind of business case, because I think human rights shouldn't be dependent on whether something is business sufficient. But again, I think actually most big organizations do recognize this, or can be very easily made to understand it. But again, it's a case of kind of will and it being considered important. And again, I go back to the kind of importance of neurodivergent people and their voice being heard, and it requires them to be organized. I think that's a general point of our society, is very often we don't have a very active, engaged citizenry. And I think that's, again, a function of kind of inequality that we've seen over the last 50 years. Yeah.
Okay. Let's assume there is an organization that has a very strong will to recognize the community voices from neurodivergent people.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps they have very ambitious and capable potential neurodivergent leaders like you. How would the organization be able to recognize this community in the first place? How do they identify neurodivergent talented people?
Yeah, I think the first step is to be, you have to be safe for that community to come out in public.
Yeah.
You have to be open, you have to be welcoming, and you have to do that in a public way. I mean, I try and do it in my own way by being open about my autism. I try and encourage others to be themselves publicly. I think that's very important. So there's definitely certain things that individuals can do. So in the case of kind of particular leaders, those who are already comfortable with talking about who they are, I think absolutely should do that. For an organisation to have this, for this organisation that wants to take this seriously, have a open, inclusive culture. Again, not just for neurodiversity, but for everything. Both for kind of protected characteristics, but also for other things that aren't directly. So, I mean, for example, I think for a university, we should talk about things like drug addiction or drug use, and talk about it openly. Similarly with sex work, for example. I think the more that you demonstrate clearly to a community that your intention is to respect them, to respect their voice, I think those voices will emerge. So first you have to make your organisation safe for them to come out publicly, and then secondly help them to encourage them to those voices to come together collectively to influence how your organisation works. It can be open to that. It requires to have a genuine spirit of collaboration. And both on the part of the staff, I think that's generally, I think staff do want to make their organisation better, or customers or a community wants to make their place better, but also with senior management. And I mean, senior management can have a variety of openness to change, and sometimes, again, depending on the issues, they may be more or less open at certain times. So it also requires senior leadership to take it seriously. And it may be that there's someone in the senior leadership team who recognises the importance. I think they probably have a role in convincing their colleagues at a senior management level to also take it seriously. So I think there's a role for kind of everybody, and that includes not just neurodivergent senior leaders, but also allies. So I think there's always things that people can do, but I think that we all have in different ways a kind of part to play in that. And I'd say anybody can do that. Anybody can have, even if it's a small, you may be you may think you are just on the kind of lowest grade or the lowest, position in an organisation with not a huge amount of influence. Maybe you don't, but you will have some influence. Even if it's just talking to the people, your colleagues, for example. I think I find that there's a lot of people have a lot more potential than we tend to realise. To change things for the better. In the case of making an organisation neurodivergent friendly, I think there's a lot of opportunities, great potential. I think it's quite exciting, really. The potential of seeing an organisation totally change. I'll just give one brief kind of practical example. Scottish Autism is a charity which works in Scotland, one of the main national Scottish organisations interested with autism. They run services for autistic people, for example. A few years ago, they had a new CEO who came in and recognised that the senior leadership and the senior management, the senior governance, the board was very few autistic people, and she made a conscious effort to recruit autistic and neurodivergent people at a level of senior leadership. And I don't know how much resistance she got from that, but I mean, I would hope not a huge amount, but she was certainly successful. That's changed. And I know that was only a few years ago for an organisation that set up for autistic people, to actually get to a point of genuine collaboration and genuine neurodivergent leadership and encouraging neurodivergent leadership. Can sometimes just take a bit of will and effort. But it can be done. And, I don't think it's not to dismiss any barriers that do exist. But no matter how hard a barrier looks like, it can be abolished, even if it looks like it can't be. I mean, we used to have slavery. We used to have the divine right of kings. If we can get rid of them, I'm pretty sure we can have a community that's neurodivergent, inclusive. I hope so.
Yeah, it's absolutely inspiring to see some changes are happening. Although they are happening so recently, I'm actually amazed. It's like, why they didn't happen earlier?
Yeah.
So yeah, and you mentioned like bring neurodivergent leaders to the senior management.
Yeah.
Will definitely help, and to incorporate more neurodivergent people's voices in research and in all kinds of discussions will help. So that's absolutely amazing. What other, like, from your personal experiences, any tips that you can provide neurodivergent, like students and like maybe people in organizations about what they can do to make their voices heard and to progress as well and to build a better community for themselves too?
I think, again, you kind of said the answer in the very end of your question there, build a community. I think
Yeah.
find your people for a start. I think it's hard. It's hard to do things by yourself, especially when you're trying to change people and societies and cultures. It's very hard to do that by yourself.
Yeah.
Again, especially for not just for students, also adults, staff too. But the benefit of finding your people is both. It's both that you get a better understanding of yourself. I mean, there's a great word. There's a great, I think, Swahili word called Ubuntu, and my understanding of it is roughly translates as "people are people through other people." Or kind of no man is an island, or however you want to phrase it. Ourselves are this. It's not a kind of, perfect, rational efficiency machine. We are human beings in societies and communities. So I think firstly, meet your people. Understand who you are, understand who others are, and work together and find the issue. Find the things that need to be changed in your context, and just work at it. Again, I find that you don't need a huge number of people with a passion to change things. Actually, I find there's always opportunities, and I think again it's kind of, you'll surprise. I think people will surprise themselves once they believe that they can change things and find other people who believe the same. I think it's quite amazing, beautiful adventures that people can have with that. And also just achieve meaningful change and make their lives better. I mean, if you can go through your life having made other people's lives better, that's lovely.
It is.
And I'm not particularly, I don't believe in an afterlife myself, but I would like to think, I hope that when it's my time to leave this planet, hopefully in 60 or 70 years' time, I'll be able to look back and go, okay, yes, I made the world a bit better. I think that would be a nice feeling, to have. And again, it's not really about being too morbid. It's about, well, what are we here on this planet for? And are we making the world better? Are we making it better for fellow humans? I hope we are.
Yes, we're doing it. We're recording this podcast
right
as well. Yeah. So we're definitely making the voices heard and raising awareness on this. So we're definitely in the progress of doing that. Yeah, and you mentioned like somewhere in the world things are actually getting worse. So we're definitely trying to prevent that keep happening from So we are building a better world together.
Yeah.
That's absolutely great. Now there are a lot of places that have financial issues, right?
I wouldn't know anything about that. I wouldn't know anything about that.
Yes.
University of Dundee, I've never heard of it.
Yeah, so it's like in general, right? How do you think those financial issues has affected things and about the progress and about the communities? From
a perspective for neurodivergent people?
Yes, and
for generally?
And also as a neurodivergent leader as well, because you're managing different.
Yeah, sure. I think any organisation that's in distress, as both the University of Dundee and the Student Association are, particularly financial distress, the more, and we know it from our own personal lives, the more crisis you're in, the kind of less clear your thinking is. You're just thinking about the day to day. You're not thinking about what long-term change would I like to, deal with. So I think firstly, it just makes it harder. And again, it's not something that's it's not just unique to the University of Dundee or even, universities in Britain. It's something certainly the whole of the public sector in United Kingdom has been dealing with, the realities of shrinking budgets, shrinking resources, and also often shrinking engagement from the public or services or customers, and it makes it harder, I think, to change. One of the best ways, I think, for an organisation to have change is to have, a kind of internal and an external lobby looking for it. And that requires, I think, a level of equality in a society for people to advance their, concerns and claims. I think, so, I mean, practically, what do I do? I mean, I'll be honest. I mean, I feel totally overwhelmed at my role because the list of things that we need to sort out is like, it's like all the way here.
1,000 things on your to-do list.
Yeah. And here's the amount of power that I have, right? And here's the amount of, but the amount of potential power that an organized student body has would be way up.
Yeah.
But there are all sorts of barriers and, problems there. So being realistic, for me, I try and identify the allies that we have as students in the university body. I mean, there aren't really kind of mustache twirling villains. There aren't really kind of people who are evil generally and trying to actually how can we make autistic people suffer at the university? It's generally the kind of consequence of cuts. So to things like student services, that's a huge, huge one in terms of what we can do about it practically. I mean, I try and raise my voice and try and encourage students to raise their voice to reverse particular cuts, things like student services, which are essential, and literally life-saving in the case of some. I think everybody generally recognizes on some level the importance of them, but simply recognizing that something's important doesn't solve a financially distressed organization. So I mean, partly I also I try and spend some of my time lobbying the national structures, so Scottish government, not just me doing that, it's my counterparts and other Scottish student unions and also universities generally. The reality is there's only so much you can do within a certain system, a certain level. When it comes to the funding of the university sector, that's not something the University of Dundee can directly do a huge amount about. That's going up to the level of the Scottish or the British government. So again, there I look, well, what are my allies in that? And there, for example, it's the civil service, the civil society organisations that do care about this. I mean, just on 2 days ago, on Saturday, 25th, there was a march in Edinburgh called Scotland Demands Better, and it was a group of all sorts of church leaders and charities and trade unions and so on, calling for proper investment in public services, which in my view totally includes universities as well. So partly it's about kind of identifying those kind of allies to try and change things at a big level, but that's kind of long-term stuff. I mean, it is important. I think again the temptation when you're dealing with difficult day-to-day stuff is to just deal with the day-to-day stuff, and I do that. But what we also need to be able to do is simultaneously do that and then also deal with the kind of big picture stuff. But again, I say I'm overwhelmed. As an autistic person, the one thing that I dislike the most is not knowing, is my life going to change significantly like tomorrow or in a week, the change aspect. The fact that I know that every single day I'm going to feel ineffective and overwhelmed actually is kind of relaxing in a way, because it's just a constant level of pressure. It's not variable. If it was variable, that would be annoying. But I just know that each day I'm going to fail.
So every day is super. You're so super stressful.
But genuinely, it's here's the ways in which I know that I'm going to fail, but I'm going to try my best. So I feel kind of comfortable in myself that I'm doing what I can with my resources and skills, as in the reality of the situation. So I mean, I don't really kind of have a solution for what do you do in a financially distressed organization?
Realistically, do you think it will cost a lot of money to make those changes? It's is it going to? Isn't it cost-effective ways to make quick changes?
I mean, some don't. That's the thing. You're right. I mean, some do cost money. I mean, there are some that are just hard questions of resourcing, and eventually that just kind of gets to issues of kind of class and power and big kind of structures. On a more perhaps more immediately practical level, there are definitely always changes can make. I mean, a lot of it comes from ignorance, and I just mean lack of understanding, rather than anything malicious. Sometimes it's just there needs to be more training, for example. I mean, these are all good things, which some cost money, some don't. there are some things, sometimes it's just a case of having a priority, and then pushing that as a priority. And again, that can come from, can come from below, making that a pressure onto making that a priority for someone. Could be someone in senior management going, right, this is a priority. It could be both. So some things don't really cost money. I mean, sometimes it's a case of resource, sometimes it's a case of, let's just change a policy, let's make it. And I do see that. I mean, I see that in my work with student appeals, for example. Sometimes it's just a case of, well, actually, the policy is we're actually going to treat autistic people as human beings. Basically, it's kind of how you read it, and then they go, "Oh, right, yes, sorry about that."
Okay.
I mean, it's not how it gets phrased, but that's basically what happens sometimes. Sometimes it's just the policy isn't being followed, and it just requires someone like me to do my job, to chasing up other people to make sure they're doing their job.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think you're getting to a good point. You got to think you're hitting on a good point, which is that there are always things that can be done that don't take a lot of resources or time and money. And partly it's just about spreading the word and putting the message out there, like you're doing right now.
Yeah, exactly. I'm so happy you're mentioning training and everything, because that is what our project is actually trying to provide as well, to raise awareness and provide such trainings that are going to help you to achieve your vision. And since we are going to talk about long-term and your strategic actions, what is your vision for the long term, since you're mentioning about, not just day-to-day practices, but also what you are going to do in the long run? What's your ultimate vision? What is the world you want to be for neurodivergent?
My term ends in about 8 months, so this is the problem. My day job, I'm kind of obliged to think in the relative short term. So thank you for the opportunity to kind of think of a kind of utopia. I think it would be a world which has cultures, institutions, societies that fully respect the rights of everybody, and does that quite seriously, and has that as its number one priority above other priorities, such as trying to maintain a monopoly of power, or trying to create the most monetary value out of a system which should never be monetized, for example. And I think that speaks to the generally, I think at heart, collaborative nature of what it is to be human. I think that it's not to say that there isn't an element, there's competition is part of human nature. Yes, it's a part. I think collaboration is a much bigger part, frankly, and I think it's often something that doesn't get focused on, doesn't get glamorized, it doesn't get valorized, it doesn't get promoted as much. I think it depends, different bits of the university will, I mean, even if you take business, for example, I think my view is that I think the best business ventures, certainly the best business people are the ones that actually do understand that they are part of a society, they're part of a community, that they are creating products or services that people find useful. So I would say you'd have a society, you have a world in which fundamentally on one level, that the motive to accumulate power or accumulate profit is, if it's not totally absent, it's much smaller compared to the motive to make the world better, to make sure that our neighbours have houses that don't have damp in them, for example. In terms of neurodiversity, it would, I think, again, the more equal a society is, the better it's going to particularly be for neurodivergent people. And I think once you have that equal society, a lot of the prejudice and discrimination and violence that a lot of people experience, a lot of people at the bottom experience, I think goes away, because I think a lot of that comes from an experience of scarcity, or an experience of having to constantly struggle for your position. And I see it with, for example, anti-refugee protests. I think if you had an equal society, I think you wouldn't have anti-refugee protests. I think we would recognize in an equal society that we would be welcoming. And I do see that. I do actually see more welcoming, a more welcoming sentiment than the very loud, very small minority that, for example, go and protest at refugee accommodation. But the instinct to see difference as a threat, see others as a threat, I think that fundamentally, I think it comes from a place of insecurity. And I think we have to ask, why is it that we have a society that creates that kind of insecurity? So again, I think it would be a society which would also, it would have a much more humane approach to the justice system, for example. So instead of locking people up, are there other ways that are more genuinely rehabilitative for not just that individual, for the whole of society? And same with the education system as well. I think I could go on a whole lecture about the education system and how we could make it more neurodivergent friendly. And I kind of drift between, there are things that we can do to make the education system better, and thinking, well, actually, the education system fundamentally is just so broken, we should do something completely different and have a schooling system. But I suppose I'll just end on to go back to what I said earlier about neurodivergent voices being part of the solution in creating policies. I think that instead of just thinking about that end goal of what would a ideal society look like, I think it's interesting to think about how that would be created. And I think that's going to be created by the full inclusion of everybody, including neurodivergent voices, in creating that society, in creating that change. And I think if we prioritize that, if we fund it, if we resource it properly, and also if we believe in ourselves. So self-belief, I think, is something that often doesn't get talked about in these senses, in these kind of processes of change. I think it's very important to have that, individual and collective self-belief. But if you have that if you have that process, if you have that inclusion, I think that kind of society is possible. And I think it is being created right now.
Yeah.
I think it's being created in the actions and the hearts and the minds of people who want that, both consciously and unconsciously. And I take a lot of solace. I don't focus too much on the negative not because I try and bury my head in the sand, but because I think there's so much, beauty and potential, both in individuals and in, the human species as a whole, that, I've only got one life. I think I'll spend my time working with that, Well, maybe I've got more than one life. I don't know. I don't know. But, for now, try and do that.
Oh,
how's that?
That's amazing. And we are going to invite you back anyway. Okay. So at least you can have more than one episode to talk about this, and we can make things happen together. And to reassure you, like I believe, and I believe everybody in this room believes. So at least we are starting from somewhere, and we are going to achieve this beautiful world, and definitely trying to achieve your vision together. So thank you so much, Tánaiste, and for such an open and inspiring conversation. You have reminded us that neurodiversity is not an limitation at all. And we have amazing neurodivergent leaders like you.
I would say, actually, I was going to say, it took me a while to realize that actually neurodiversity isn't a disability. I used to think that being neurotypical was a disability. I thought that their obsession with eye contact, their weirdness about social cues, and strange obsessions, like football and fashion, were severe disabilities. I look down on them, I have to admit. But now having appreciation for, neurodiversity means actually including these neurotypical people. I don't think they're disabled at all. I think they can achieve a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, just have different styles, different preferences. Just kind of hype in different ways. Yeah, but you are definitely super talented. We can tell just from this conversation, you are super knowledgeable. Yeah, very capable of doing so many amazing things.
Well, I just think that just neurotypical people, they need to hear you're valid as well. Okay, neurotypical people. Okay, you can achieve anything. Okay.
Yes.
I believe in you.
Yes, we believe in you. Yeah, I'm neurotypical, but yeah. I believe in myself, and we just believe in ourselves. Yeah, that's absolutely amazing. So to everyone watching, thank you for joining us for this episode of Inclusive Futures, Voices for Change. Together, let's keep building a world where every mind can thrive.
Well, like that.
Yeah.